and welcome to Africa Amplified, Bloomberg's monthly show bringing stories from the continent to the rest of the world. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. For the next half hour, we're going to look into aviation. It is peak travel season in many parts of the world, and people are taking full advantage of that. We've largely seen global air traffic return to pre-pandemic levels, but it's not quite the same picture here in Africa. The continent makes up just over 17% of the global population, but only about 2% of total worldwide travel. We're going to look into the opportunities to maximize the potential of intra-Africa travel, as well as the hurdles that lie ahead. Later, we'll also hear from two of the continent's biggest central bankers about their path to disinflation. But first, as we always do, our reporters have more with us from across the African continent. We'll get you the latest from here in Johannesburg and take you to Nairobi in the east. But let's start out west in Lagos and bring in Nigeria's bureau chief. Nigeria's Monetary Policy Committee is gearing up for its next meeting later this month, and it is coming as the nation faces rampant inflation and a weakening naira. Central Bank Governor Olayemi Cardoso told me in his first major interview that he's prioritizing price pressures.
We are moving towards an inflation targeting framework, and we've announced that. It isn't something that we expect to be able to jump to overnight. It needs a lot of forward guidance. It needs a lot of collaboration between the fiscal and the monetary side, but it is certainly a major goal for us.
For more, let's bring in our Nigeria Bureau Chief, Anthony Osei-Brown, out of Lagos. Anthony, the Nigerian Central Bank's Monetary Policy Committee is meeting later this month. What's the expectation here, especially after we heard from Cardoso?
Yeah, I think as you just heard him say, the focus will be on cutting down curbing inflation, which is currently around 34%. And they've made some progress. We're seeing month-on-month inflation decelerate for 3 consecutive months. So we're seeing it coming down, but the expectation is that they may still hike. As you said, the focus is on taking inflation down to around 20% by the end of the year. And that means they still need to. But so far, since the beginning of the year, they've hiked rates by 750 basis points. So the expectation is they may still hike at least 50 basis points again to keep inflation going down till by the end of the year.
Right, and they've hiked consecutively for more than 10 meetings. Thanks so much, Anthony Osei-Brown from Lagos, for that update. Also this week, we heard from the South African Reserve Bank governor after the new coalition cabinet was announced. Lesetja Kganyago welcomed the reappointment of Enoch Godongwana as finance minister.
We do take comfort, by the way, that we still have the same Minister of Finance that we have been talking to, who has always been providing guidance and leadership on macroeconomic policy, and that gives us comfort.
Let's bring in Ntando Takwana, who is here in Johannesburg, been covering this quite busily, Ntando. So let's talk about this cabinet. It's unprecedented. It is multi-party. And as Enoch was just saying there, as Lesetja was just saying there, the finance minister is staying put. Are markets pleased by this outcome?
Yes, they are pleased. They are very confident that policy continuity is going to continue and that Enoch Godongwana is going to continue with his fiscal consolidation efforts. And markets, even before the elections, were favouring a government formation that includes the ANC and a centrist party like the DA. And now that that is the case, the next thing that they're going to be watching out for is how policy takes its shape. And the next coming days are going to be crucial as the ANC, its National Executive Committee, meets this weekend to discuss the GNU and some policy matters. And in the next week, we'll see government's executive, the new executive, meet to discuss some of the key priorities for the 7th administration. And that is some of what the markets will be looking out for.
And Ntando, there's more than 11 there's 11 parties that are represented in this new government. We've seen a little bickering at the local level. I mean, what does this potentially mean at the national level? Are we going to see these rivals actually get things done?
I think in principle, all of these political parties have said that they want to work together, and so there is a willingness to work together. But we've seen even publicly how, these negotiations have panned out. We've seen a lot of contestation, a lot of fighting one another for key posts in the cabinet, and we've seen these political parties, especially between the DA and the ANC, really struggle to find consensus. And if that continues, it then exposes how fragile or that the government of national unity could easily be threatened. Its stability could easily be threatened, and those are some of the issues that we might see.
Right, and markets don't want to see,
No.
notably. Bloomberg's Ntando Takwana here in Johannesburg with that update. Ntando, thanks so much. Let's go now to Nairobi, where deadly anti-government demonstrations have pushed the government into uncharted territory. Protesters are calling for a clampdown on state corruption, despite President William Ruto scrapping his controversial finance bill last week. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Simon Marks for more. So, Simon, this has been a really fascinating turnaround story to really pay close attention to. I mean, what is it that that the president is looking out for now? What is it that what's his next move?
Well, President William Ruto has made a few concessions. Obviously, he's revoked the finance bill, so he has to start from scratch in terms of balancing his country's budget. And he's also put forward a few other measures, such as freezing the salaries of civil servants, including his own salary, actually. But he's in a tricky spot because the majority of the protesters are still not happy enough. And you have many people calling for his resignation. This has gone way beyond taxes at this point in Kenya. People are upset with the conduct of police, with corruption, with how the state is managed, with inequality, joblessness. And it's a young generation who all say they're more aware than their parents were and are extremely keen to see real profound change within Kenya. So, you know, President William Ruto is going to have to do a lot more than just freeze a few wages and revoke some taxes.
Well, and Simon, what could this potentially mean because we know that the IMF was actually sort of part of the reason why Kenya was sort of calling for increased taxes. What does this mean for negotiations there and for the economy more broadly? Yeah,
well, you know, I think in terms of speaking with the IMF, they have to go back to the drawing board and come up with new plans. You know, Ruto's already said that a lot of the measures, the safety net measures in terms of helping farmers with their fertilizers, creating jobs for teachers will have to be put on ice for the moment until they find new ways of actually coming up with these funds and these cuts. So he really has to go back to the drawing board, speak to his financial committee and work out how indeed they're going to balance the books, because there's not many choices. Either they cut taxes or they go back to the market and they borrow more, which they can't really do because they're in a really tough spot. I think from 2.3 trillion shillings, which is around $18 billion that they raised in taxes, 1.1 trillion shillings went to debt financing last year. So, you know, you can really see the pressure on the state.
Yeah, and we know that this is not just happening in Kenya. There's many other African countries and countries globally that are facing similar predicaments. Simon Marks out of Nairobi. Simon, thanks so much for joining us this morning and for that updated report. All right, coming up, global and regional aviation power brokers converge here in South Africa to push the sector to new heights. We speak to some of them, including the head of Africa's Aviation Association and also IATA's chief economist. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. The health of an airline is measured by the number of tickets it sells. Yet while passenger revenue typically outstrips cargo, the opposite is often the case in Africa. Higher container shipping rates, a lack of proper infrastructure, and onerous trade barriers on the continent often mean it's cheaper to move cargo by air. That's part of the reason why U.S. carriers United Airlines and Delta have grown their footprint on the continent, driven by export demand. Both airlines now compete in places like Cape Town, an otherwise smaller market for passenger traffic. But when it comes to cargo, this is the main gateway to North America for fruit exporters, among Africa's biggest industries. Another example is Ethiopian Airlines' recent $55 million investment in a cargo center in Addis Ababa. Perhaps logical then that over the past year, Rwanda Air, Kenya Airways, and Angola Airlines added cargo aircraft to their fleet. With African cargo volume surging and air travel seen doubling to over 300 million passengers by 2040, little wonder why continental carriers such as Rwanda Air and foreign airlines like Qatar Airways are eager to grow their networks.
And that was a look at the barriers and opportunities for African aviation. Meanwhile, the International Air Transport Association has been urging governments in Africa to use air travel to help boost economic performance. Local carriers are set to make a profit in 2024. That's according to IATA. The organization has just met here in Johannesburg to promote its Focus Africa initiative. We've spoken with some of the industry's top voices, including Secretary General of the African Airlines Association, Abdérahmane Berthé. Here's what he had to say.
The market is fragmented. If you look at the number of airlines on the continent and the willingness of states for sovereignty to have their own national carriers, but we know that this is not viable because if you look at globally, consolidation is really the process which will give more power to airlines. So in Afra, we are pushing for consolidation. And I honestly think that the continent doesn't need more than 6 or 7 global operators. I mean by global operators, an airline which can operate on the continent and globally on other regions. And we need also to have an intra-African airlines ecosystem, which will work with these global operators to feed and defeat into some hub on the continent. It means also maybe we need 6 or 7 hubs.
That was African Airlines Association Secretary General Abdérahmane Berthé speaking with us. Subscribers can head to Bloomberg.com for the full interview. And as we mentioned, we also caught up with the IATA Chief Economist Marie Owens Thomsen to get her view on the path ahead for the sector. Here's part of that conversation.
Aviation is a uniquely global industry, and it really needs a level playing field for planes to be able to fly from one place to the next. And not face, different conditions every place they land. So that's very complicated in Africa. And then there are other real hindrances, such as the price of fuel, which is actually on average 20% more expensive in Africa than in other places. So that's obviously a direct hit on the profitability of airlines in Africa. And also, I would say that taxes, which tend to be higher in Africa than in other places, although most countries do resort to some kind of taxation on ticket prices, but Africa seems to be more fond of that exercise than other places.
What are the bright spots then? Because we are seeing some airlines on the continent doing well in their own respective countries. I mean, what is it that IATA sort of sees as potentially helping the continent to get over some of those hurdles that you were describing?
Well, I think it's very much a question of how you position aviation in your national politics. If you position aviation as really a vector for economic development, that it is, not only aviation, I should say, all forms of transportation, all forms of connectivity are vectors for economic development. And clearly, economic development is sorely needed on the African continent. So if you position aviation in that light and regard it as an ally in your drive for creating better economic outcomes for your population, then the policies that you might choose might not be the same subset of policies as if you think that aviation is only reserved for the rich.
That was Marie Owens-Thomsen, IATA's chief economist, speaking with us there. All right, and coming up, we hear from the CEO of Airlink on how global players are taking an interest in African aviation. But first, we'll leave you with his main competitor, the CEO of South African Airlines, John Lamola, on his outlook for the company.
The South African Airways that we have now is different from the pre-COVID South African Airways. Okay? The pre-COVID South African Airways was fueled by taxpayers' money. It had a history that is well known of corrupt practices and so on. So we have a different South African Airways where we are surviving on our own steam. We do what we can afford, and there's a culture within the organization of being happy and proud with what we are doing now.
The Middle Eastern carriers have developed wonderful hub-and-spoke network systems reaching all corners of the globe, and they have comprehensive reaches into Africa. And it's those comprehensive reaches that we are partnering with, in and out of Johannesburg, Cape Town, but not just that. We see them operating to other destinations like Harare and Lusaka and Dar es Salaam, Luanda, Maputo, and in time we believe that other points, important nodes within Africa, will be connected through the Middle East to the rest of the world. We don't see the Middle East on their own. We also see Istanbul as a relevant hub, and Turkish, and we see Addis and Ethiopian as a relevant hub, well positioned with a strategic advantage of centrality.
So can you confirm, Qatar Airways has told us they are investing in a Southern African airline. Is it potentially Airlink that the investment, the partnership is going to happen?
We have conversations with all of our airline partners, and some of them relate to all kinds of strategy and synergies between us. And of course, from time to time, there are discussions about capital and about equity participation. Having said that, we have these conversations. We do not have any irrevocable binding agreement with any of our partners right now as we speak.
At this point, but potentially some down the road.
There could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was Rodger Foster, CEO of South African airline Airlink. For more on the state of African airlines, let's bring in the head of Bloomberg's global aviation reporting, Benny Kamel, joining us from Frankfurt this morning. Benedict, thanks so much for joining us. So we've been hearing from a lot of the power brokers across the continent, and specifically in the aviation sector. What can you tell us, as someone who covers this quite closely, about the progress that we've seen in African aviation?
So about a month ago, we had IATA, which is the Global Aviation Association. They came together in Dubai to sort of give an outlook for the year, how things are looking. And the good news for Africa is that it's going to be another year of profit for the continent. They're going to make a small profit of about 100 million, but albeit a profit. But 100 million obviously isn't a huge amount of money. That translates into just 90 cents per passenger. So you can get a sense of just how razor thin the margins are in this industry, and that's the big challenge for African aviation. How do you get a continent that is really on the move, how do you get it to become more profitable, to become a larger part of the network? And you see some players in the industry like Ethiopian, like South African. We just heard from the CEO saying this company is on the mend, but it's still a small player. How do you get these to become larger, international, more connected players? That's something that will be closely watched in the next couple of years. How do you sort of become the next Qatar, shall we say, the next Emirates, the next Turkish of the continent? Because right now it's a very fragmented market. It has weak infrastructure. It has high costs. And those are all the things that are holding back African aviation.
Yeah, and Benny, it has more than 400 airlines, which is quite a lot for the continent. I mean, when we just talk about making progress, will it come, you think, potentially from Middle Eastern carriers like Qatar, like others coming in and investing, or will we need to see some consolidation here on the continent in order to see some progress?
You're probably going to see it from both ends, but you're right that I think the initial push will come from outside. And if you mentioned some of the airlines that are really making a concerted effort in the region, you see Qatar in particular. They have a stake in Rwanda Air. We just heard from the Airlink CEO. He feigned inscrutability, and you couldn't really get a clear answer from him in terms of what's next. But we are hearing that Qatar is in advanced talks to take a stake in a South African carrier. So they could be in play, and they're sort of building these bridgeheads in the region. Turkish is a very strong player into the African market. Emirates has about 20 destinations into Africa, like places like Cote d'Ivoire, Angola, parts of Northern Africa. But you're right, longer term, this will have to come from within. Companies like Ethiopian, very strong on the continent, but they need that interconnectivity in the market to make it happen.
And Benny, in just a minute here, what's the appeal here for these global players coming in? Is it the population growth? What do you think it is?
It's absolutely that. It's the population growth. It's something we heard earlier in another part of the program. Cargo is a big part of the market. You see a lot of exports. You see fruit. You see flowers. You see fresh produce. That's going to be a big part of the story. And cargo is an important part of the aviation story. And that's where Africa can really play a role. But you've got more than 1 billion people on the move. It's twice the size in terms of population compared with Latin America. But Latin America is much bigger in terms of the revenue that it brings in. So that's where you see an opportunity going forward.
All right. Bloomberg's global aviation reporter head, Benedict Camel, joining us from Frankfurt. Benny, thank you so much for joining us. All right, that is it for Africa Amplified this month. Join us again next month and every month as we do here. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Thanks as always for joining us, and we'll see you next time.